Thank you all for coming today. I know last night was a big party night for many of you, so maybe this is the first presentation you're attending for the day. I know it's my first presentation, and I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy you guys are able to join me. So the title of the presentation today is Data-Driven Design. You've got the data, so now what? I'm joined by Jur van Tenenbroek. He's a client of ours from Uda Games, based in Holland. And I want to talk to you guys today about the frustration that not only Contagion feels, but I'm sure many of you guys feel when thinking about how to use data to drive decision-making within your organization to build better games, more engaging games, and ones that monetize better. I've traveled the world. I've spoken to thousands of developers. Some of you guys in the audience look familiar, so I'm sure I've spoken to you. 90% of the world of game development don't use data-driven design the way it should be used. 90%. So 9 out of 10 have a lot of data. I mean, data is abundant. There's plenty of data. There's data from your acquisition channels. There's data on engagement and retention. There's data on monetization. And then when you put it all together, there's plenty of information on predictive LTV that you can do. But not a lot of companies are piecing that data together and putting together the processes to process the information and use it in a way that they can make insightful decisions. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So real quick, I promise I won't talk too much about who we are, but for those of you who don't know who we are, Contagion is the leading analytics solution for social and mobile app and game developers. We process over 1.5 billion messages every day. We track 1 in every $4 spent in social games with clients like Gaia and PopCap and EA and Ubisoft and hundreds of others. We've been doing it for about 4 years. We're in 4 countries, including an office we just opened up in the UK. And we track a lot of MAU. It just gives you an idea of how much data that we process on behalf of our clients to give them insights. So we are an analytics provider, and we're also data science experts. We've got a bunch of guys in-house who help our clients understand what the data means and how they should act on it to make better decisions. Jur, you want to give a little overview of
Hello,
Uda?
everybody. I'm Jur from Uda Games, one of the founders. And I think about 1.5 years ago, we started talking to a number of companies, but also Contagion, for our social game, Governor of Poker Social. It's on Facebook right now, and I think there are not many gaming companies are prepared to work with data. I think everybody can collect data, but like Dan said, it's very important that you have to realize you need to work with data. And it was one of the very interesting things about a company like Contagion. They have people in their company as well who can really open up the mind to realize you have to interpret the data, etc., etc. So that's why it's very important to pick a right partner for doing something with the data you're getting. So that was it.
So let's start with a little test. I want to know kind of who Jur and I are talking to. This is a test that a guy named Sheridan Hitchens, who is the ex-head of BI for Kabam, he gave a little test like this at GDC last year. And I thought it was great, and I changed it up a little bit, but I wanted to give it to you guys as well. It's a simple test, but it will give me some insights into how I might want to frame this conversation. So for every statement I say that's true, give yourself 1 point, and for every statement that's false, give yourself 0. Okay? All of our producers look at their key game metrics on a daily basis. If that answer is true for you, give yourself 1 point. If it's not true, give yourself 0. Running A/B testing and understanding statistical significance is a core competency of most of our producers and our marketers. 1 for yes and a 0 for no. If we match marketing acquisition data to monetization data. Look at top of funnel all the way through in-game optimization, all the way to monetization. We understand lifetime value of our customers at a granular level: country, traffic source, demographic, behavioral cohorts, etc. We have a dedicated department that provides extensive automated analytics across all of our games, or if you have one game, across your game. And these are obviously also best practices, not just a test. And the last one, our CEO and other key leaders in the organization believe BI and analytics are an essential capability and also a key point of competitive differentiation. Okay, so raise your hand if you're snow plowing down the hill right now. Okay, and who's jumping off cliffs? Nice, and so everyone else is somewhere in the middle. Okay, good. That's kind of what I expected. So I guess my 90% score was about right, given that there was about 4 or 5 of you that raised your hand saying you're jumping off cliffs, and the rest of you said that you're not. And I think anyone that's not doing all of the things that I just talked about up there is probably not leveraging the information as best you can to make strategic decisions about your game and how to make it better, how to make it more profitable. So, what's your score?
Well, we went from I think about 0 to 4.5 in 1 year time. But that's really, really hard to do, especially keeping people, the producers, for example. It's hard to make them understand it's important. The things we are right now working on, also with Contagion, is the per player country, the complete segmentation. That's something which is we really have to dive into. But and the key persons in the company, they realize that it's data is something which you can make money with, so it's important.
So I forgot to tell you why I'm using a skiing and snowboarding analogy. First of all, I love skiing. Second of all, it's freezing out there, and it made me think of skiing. But also, there's a lot of great analogies to skiing and data that no one ever talks about, but I actually think they're very relevant. So you'll see a skiing analogy kind of throughout this presentation, and I apologize if some of the analogies are a big stretch. I really wanted to keep the skiing analogy going. Hopefully you can appreciate it. This one actually works though. So if you remember one thing from this lecture, remember this. I think this is a very simple, but also a very insightful statement that one of our clients, Mike Seago, who is the CEO of our Gaia Online, made to me just a few weeks ago. When you're learning how to ski, you learn pretty quickly that whatever direction you're looking at is the direction your skis will ultimately take you down the mountain. The same holds true for data. You really need to make sure the metrics you're looking at from the start are the ones that are most important to your business success. That's inevitably where your business will focus, right? So if you're, I've been in data-driven design for 15 years now, from e-commerce to finance and now in games. And I've never thought about it this way, but it can be incredibly harmful to your business if you focus on the wrong metrics and all the energy in the company goes around optimizing those, and you forget about the ones that are really important. You might start to optimize in an entirely different way if you think ahead of time about the KPIs, the key performance indicators, that really will make a difference at each stage throughout your game. And I'll speak to this a little bit throughout the session, but I found that extremely insightful. So what are the 7 keys to success for a data-driven organization? These are kind of best practices. These are the ones that over 4 years, working with thousands of developers at thousands of studios on tens of thousands of applications. These are the 7 best practices that we've come up with. Pick the right KPIs up front, synchronize company-wide metrics, procure the right talent, use the right tech, look at the whole picture and don't get tunnel vision, maintain perspective, and consider your application's life cycle and what that means for data. So I'm going to go through each of these. So number 1, get a trail map before you go up the chairlift, right? So picking the right KPIs before you launch your game and before each stage of the game is absolutely important. So you could have the fastest skis in the world. You could have a rocket pack on your back. But if you don't know how to get from point A to point B, you're going to get beat by even the slowest skier on the mountain, right? It's very simple. But there are actually some metrics that we've defined throughout the years that when you're just starting off, and I know a lot of the folks here at this conference are indie developers, smaller developers, haven't done a lot of data-driven design, not jumping off cliffs. But even if you are experienced, these are still the metrics that you should come back to and think about. This is the trail map that we've developed over 4 years of development consultation with our clients. Cost of acquisition is CAC. The K factor is your viral coefficient, in particular for social games, not as much for mobile. Average session length, a really important engagement statistic. Average user lifetime, another really important engagement and retention metric. Percent paying users, how many of my users am I monetizing on a monthly basis or on a shorter cohort? My ARPU, or my average revenue per user, and my RPPU, or my average revenue per paying user. And I put a little bracket in there. These are also the most important metrics when you think about mobile, with the exception of K-factor. And I'll go over at the end of the presentation some of the challenges that analysts and companies are having with mobile development when it comes to data-driven design. So we've been working with Ur for a little while now, and Ur has implemented some of these 7 metrics. But Ur, what do you think are some of the more important ones for your company at Uda Games?
Well, first of all, I would advise either to learn very fast or get some help. Small example is that for Governor of Poker, we started to sum up some of the things we wanted to have measured, and some people, they didn't get further than, okay, we need to know if it's a male or if it's a female, and how many times he played the game or how many times he played poker. And then after some intensive sessions we had inside the company, the same people got really enthusiastic, and then they came up with ideas like, we need to know if they are playing poker for the second time in the first game, and they collected chips. After that they went to the building and they reached a higher level, and so they were getting totally lost. So what we're trying to do also is get some of the really important basic statistics, and then also even iterate on that. As we go, we know we need to measure extra stuff. So what we try to do is every move a player makes is going to be measured, literally everyone. And then we start building up, also with the knowledge of Contagion, we start to add the funnels at the stage where we know we also want to measure this or that, etc., etc. So it's also a very organic process that will keep on going.
Yeah, and Ur and I were actually talking about this last night, but so these are the top 7 metrics that are most important to start off with. It gives you some focus. Ur has experienced this firsthand, where you get an organization, you're in your weekly meetings, and you're talking about what interesting hypotheses you have about user behavior, and I wonder what happens with someone who buys this item and is a male and is in this age segment and came in at this time period versus this other cohort with these very complex attributes. You can go on for days and days and days coming up with lists of hypotheses, and it can be incredibly inefficient if you do that too soon. So these are what you start with, right? But at some point you're going to want to ski off-piste, and we're going to give you a trail map for that as well, and that gets a little bit more deep, a little bit more rigorous with the kind of custom cohorting and data mining that you want to do within your data to ask the deeper questions. So,
yeah.
Okay, best practice number 2, synchronize your efforts across the organization. The most successful organizations that we work with, Gaia Online, PopCap, and Ubisoft are probably 3 that I can think of, and soon Uda Games as well, are the ones that truly make the data accessible throughout the organization. So it's not just the fact that there is a dashboard and that everybody can access that dashboard with easy-to-read stats, but it's the meetings that happen on a regular basis. It's the questions that are asked that forces everybody in the organization to ask the right questions that ultimately help optimize the economics of your user base. So our unofficial tagline at Contagion is, measure and optimize your customer economics at every stage in the game across every level of the organization. It's not measure and optimize the KPI that will make your marketing program better, or make sure all of the events in your game are firing off on a regular basis and you have the efficiencies you need, or that this item is better than this item, so you need to swap those out. Those kinds of analyses and optimizations will happen on a daily basis. But to get true organizational-wide synchronicity with data, you really need to think about things at a cost of acquisition and an LTV basis and consider the ROI in all the decisions that are made. So a good example, I'll show you a good example. So this is one client that we had, and they were looking at retention curves. And 1 and 7 day retention are two of those engagement metrics that fit very cleanly into those 7 metrics that I talked about earlier. 1 day tells you, are people coming back into my game between 24 and 48 hours after they first installed? Either this applies to both mobile and to Facebook and any other social network. And 7 day is it sticky? Did they come back for more a week later? What percentage of that cohort of users did that? They saw diverging trends where their 1 day retention rate was climbing and it was very healthy, but their 7 day retention rate was declining. And that told them that things were really good in the beginning, but for whatever reason, in those first 7 days, they weren't able to hold on to the downloaders. So it's actually really hard to kind of scale your business if this is happening. It's hard to increase DAU without keeping your cost of acquisition extremely high. So some of the questions that the CEO then asked. So he asked the marketing person, which marketing channels were producing the less engaged users, and it forced them to go in and look at the attribution and the cohorts of users coming from various campaigns to see which ones were performing, which ones were monetizing, which ones weren't. They were looking at the producers, asking if there was some kind of drop-off at some particular stage in the game, or if there was some item that was scaring people away. They were asking the engineers if there was some bug, or if certain events weren't firing off. It was one trend that the CEO recognized, and it caused an entire organization to rally around the point. It wasn't just, we need to acquire better users. It wasn't just, there's an event that's happening in the game that's preventing people from sticking around. It's the combination of the whole. So you probably have a good example of this, don't you?
Yeah, it was with a PC game, which we also were checking on data. And marketing noticed that there were not so many people clicking on the buy button. So they started thinking about pushing in more users to the game to get more people also buying it. And that's very important to make it cross-organization. So at that point we started to cooperate internally. Marketeer went to the engineer, and they were really diving into the statistics at that point. And they noticed that at level 6 in the game, a lot of people just dropped out. It took, I think, 3 or 4 people to realize that the problem was there was a lobster in the game, and there was an enemy. And you had to click the lobster to kill it. But it had a glowing tail, and if the tail was glowing and you click it, you die from it. So there was a tutorial there, but we noticed that people don't read tutorials. So they clicked away the tutorial, then they clicked on the lobster, they died. And people who die in the game don't tend to retry. Well, some do, but you play the game, you die, you say, ah, crap, you leave the game, and you don't continue. It took about a week to find the problem and to fix the problem, so a relatively small amount of time. And after we changed it, we changed something in the game mechanic. There was a 19% increase of people getting to the buy page after we changed that. So that's 19%. I mean, there are people investing a lot of money only to get 1% extra conversion, for example. And it's so easy when you are able to combine the information in the company and get a 19% extra, increase of revenue. So. Yeah.
So the bottom line is data is a great instigator of root cause analysis to figure out what are the things that you need to pull on, what are the switches, what are the levers you need to pull on throughout the organization to make the efficacy of your game better.
The marketeer would have never find it out by himself, so that's right. Why it's so important to have more people check it out.
Yep. So lesson number 3 that we've learned is hire the right guide. This is not an advertisement for Contagion. That guide could be a team of folks that you have in-house, a BI organization, a group of analysts. It could be Contagion, it could be someone else. But it is absolutely critical that you have a trail guide who knows the terrain, who's done it before, who has the domain expertise. Facebook games have been around for years. Mobile games, not quite as long. The game life cycle hasn't matured as much. There's a lot to be desired with regards to the amount of data we can get from mobile. But there's a lot of learnings, and there's a lot of people out there that know kind of what those learnings are going to be and have seen the trends and the patterns. And it's easier if you have a guide. We serve as a guide for our clients, but a lot of our clients hire in-house, and they've got some great internal guides. I was in the UK a couple days ago meeting with a client, a great client of ours, who is probably a 4 in the scale of 0 to 6, because they use Contagion, they get the data, they use our data mining tool to get real flexible access to a lot of the custom cohorting that they want to, but they only have one guy who's responsible for all of the data analysis. He borrows resources from engineering to run SQL queries, and he's competing for his time, because he's the CTO, against all the other engineering requirements, which is a huge opportunity cost to actually building the game and building a better game. And he gets meetings once a week with the various teams in the organization to try to make that data do something for them. He's a 4, and it's one guy. You need a team, or you need to outsource it. Or you need to be thinking about what materials you can get to just learn about the domain expertise that a lot of guys before you have gotten, or obviously a lot of you guys have been in this game for a long time. Picking the right gear that's right for you. This is a big one. It's kind of the build versus buy. It's a philosophical debate that has been going on for as long as software has been around. There's lots of options when it comes to choosing the right analytics solution. Should you build it or should you buy it? I mean, there's plenty of solutions. There's lots of ways you can use Hadoop and a Hive cluster and use Vertica and use a lot of different in-house solutions. And then there's plenty of SaaS cloud-based delivered solutions like Contagion as well. It really comes down to asking the right questions to figure out what kind of solution is right for you. Now, if you're a small developer, if you're a smaller shop and you're building your first game, most definitely you would not want to build your own analytics solution. There are off-the-shelf solutions that work quite well at answering all of the important questions out of the box. Bigger companies have a lot of these questions to ask, and for a lot of you smaller guys out there, pretty soon you're going to have these questions to ask too. So these are just some of the kinds of things that we've thought about when you consider whether or not you ought to build or buy your own. So some of the questions that go along with these are, what are the time and costs involved in building out a fully functional data warehouse, and what's the ongoing maintenance costs? How long before we outgrow the system and it needs to be rebuilt? Who in the organization knows metrics to track today, and which ones the industry will find important tomorrow, and can we bake that into our analytics system? What happens when our data grows by 10x and our MAUs maybe grow by 100x over the next few months? Will my system be prepared for that? Can my business afford to lose data? Is there failover planning? So there's a lot of thoughts that go into build versus buy. So when you guys chose Contagion, what were maybe some of the things that you guys were thinking about?
Well, building ourselves is I would not recommend doing that. Many of you are a game development company and not a data statistic system building company. And it's like asking the same question, are you also willing to build your own financial system? Or are you also willing to build your own customer support system? Well, you can build the base, but it will take up a lot of resources, which you could also use to build better games. And besides that, it will be something you have to be working on for the end of days. So you will have to improve it. It will keep on taking resources. It's not a build and done deal. So that was why it was a fairly easy decision to us to use other partners who have good systems like Contagion, and to use that service. And it's not very cheap, but it's a lot. I think it's a lot more cost effective rather than building it yourself. Maybe until you grow into a certain size of company, I can imagine you build an additional own system to track other data that Contagion maybe is not, or is tracking different in a different way. But even then, I would never do it.
All right. So number 5, look out for crevasses. Don't get caught up looking at the wrong data that may lead you astray, and you might ski off a cliff. Time loss could be detrimental to your success. The ability to iterate and work on a fast release cycle is obviously critical in social and mobile, a little bit more challenging in mobile. But it's real easy to look at a data point and think you're seeing the whole story, right? So an example, and this is a client of ours, and this is a very common use case, is the client saw that his percentage of paying users was rising. A great stat to be looking at, one of our 7 core metrics on our trail map, right? Percentage of paid users over, in this case, a 1-month period had climbed from 10 bips all the way on up to 25 bips. So a 2.5 times increase in your percentage of paying users, which is really pretty incredible trend line. Okay, so when they were looking at this, they weren't looking at anything else. This was, for whatever reason, they were wholly focused on the percent of paying users. How well were they converting the guys that were downloading their application free to play and then turning in and buying some item at some point during that first month? That stat was just telling them volumes. What they weren't looking at as closely as they should have was their average revenue per daily uniques, right, or their ARPU, which was trending down pretty severely. So for every chart that you look at, there's usually another chart you ought to be looking at, or probably a number of charts that you should be looking at, because if your percent of paying users is increasing, but those users are spending a lot less money, what's going to happen? Your revenue is not going to go up. It's actually going to start trending down at an even faster rate exponentially. So there's a lot of cases like this. Another one of our clients was looking at their average revenue per daily unique, and retention rate was slipping, which had a terrible effect on their lifetime value, right? So their money was going up short term, retention rate was trailing off, so the lifetime value of the users was really getting hurt. Do you have any examples of this?
Well, it's not really similar, but it does point out you have to check more than one statistic. We had some sales going down on the platform, and but all other statistics looked good. I mean, users were not declining, downloads were not declining. So, but we noticed sales were. So we were tracking about 6 different statistics on that, and they were all green. They were all okay, but still sales went down. And so we noticed we were just looking at the wrong data, and the data we should have been looking at is a successful install. For example, in this case, there was an error in the system which we were not checking out. So it's important not to only focus too much on the one line, but keep in mind at least the 7 others or 6 others, which will tell you a complete story.
Yep. So the lesson here is don't look at any one data point in isolation. It can be a terrible mistake.
Unless it's revenue going.
Unless it's revenue going up, and then just forget about everything else. Just keep doing what you're doing. And that's the debate on data-driven design altogether, right? Number 6 is maintain perspective, right? This is I think a fairly basic one, but one that probably can't be emphasized enough. It's just follow the scientific process. Start at a very high level, very broadly, look at the 7 metrics, start to peel the onion back and look behind the curtain and figure out what's driving those things, and then start looking at the individual data points and the cohorts of users that you think are driving that behavior. Do not start on the right side. I promise you we've seen it happen too often. Ask the questions, come up with a list of questions. In fact, last night Yer came to us, and this is the first time that Yer and I met, and he's been a client for a while. And he said, look at all the questions that my team came up with. He's scrolling through his iPad. And we said, wow, that's a lot of questions. But like, what about these big things?
Yeah.
And he said,
it's an enthusiastic team.
A very enthusiastic team, which is great, because they're all thinking about how data can drive their understanding of how users interact with their application. But until you solve the very basic things, I promise you, you'd be making a mistake to get too deep too fast. It's a lesson that we've learned with our clients the hard way. And the last point, which is a kind of a multi-step point, is kind of breaking the data into the stages of your game lifecycle. So this is the typical way that Contagion views the world with regards to social and mobile game development and the lifecycle of your application. Right? So you got the build phase, you have the scale phase, and then you have the harvest phase. Right? So I'll go into a little bit more information, but I think the important thing is earlier in the presentation I spoke about how important data-driven design is on two fronts. Number one is make sure the data is applicable at each stage in each phase within your organization. So the marketing team has one set of data points, the producers have another set. The collaboration between all those is super important. The other dimension is what phase your game is in. That's the other crosstab you should think about when you think about what are the important KPIs or data points to your game. So breaking it down as basically as I think I can is, so you've got your stages of your game, starting with beta testing, build, scale, and harvest, right? And then you've got your ARM funnel, or your acquisition, engagement, retention, and monetization kind of phases of the acquisition and monetization funnel. And there are certain key performance indicators that are important at each of these different phases, right? So first, the build phase. So you're building your game, and you want to get it out to market. You need to prove that there's a market. So you're out of closed beta. You tested it with a couple hundred people. It's looking good. All the events are firing off. There's no bugs. People seem to like it. But the build phase is really about proving the concept at a bit of a bigger scale and making sure you got engagement, and making sure people enjoy your game, and making sure that there's an opportunity to monetize at some point. So some of the questions I think you should be asking yourself at this stage from a data perspective is, how should I segment my marketing campaigns to get visibility into different groups of users? Which regions should I target and test? This is early on. These are the things that we're seeing our clients do at this phase that's helping them understand the data better. It's helping them focus on the data points that are relevant to them. By marketing channel, which user segments are the most influential, are the most engaged, and are the most avid? And which ones are the most high monetizing? And the metrics you ought to focus on at this stage are very simply your cost of acquisition, your 1-day retention, your 7-day retention, and your average session length. So your acquisition cost, your 1 and 7-day retention, and your average session length. Just look at those 4 metrics. You can look at 20 metrics at this stage, but those 4 are the most important that will help you determine whether or not moving to the next stage is important. And so we're working with Uta Games now, and I think Uta Games is probably at the phase where they're moving from blue to red, right?
Yeah,
you guys are just at that point.
We're with 1 or 2 feet in red.
Okay, so what are some of the considerations that you guys made when you were deciding whether or not it was time to start scaling?
Well, we have to scale.
You don't have to.
It's not really an option not to. But now it's we had some set dates which we thought we wanted to launch the game, and those were wrong because it was more important to check out if all the systems indeed were working, and also if the social aspect of the game is working correctly. So what we also did, and not many social developers do that, we had a whitelist in the beginning. Well, a lot of people do that. So you had to subscribe to be able to play the game. And I think about 3,000 people were accepted onto the whitelist. But the small change we made is that when somebody would invite another person from within the game, it will be automatically whitelisted. So we could also already test the social and measure the social aspect of the game. And when we saw that that was working to a certain amount of satisfaction through the data we were looking at, we figured we could take the next step. And scaling is a lot of work, not only on data but also on server side stuff. So we are using dynamic systems to scale up and scale down the servers, stuff like that. So it's we're in that phase right now, and on many levels. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so as you enter that phase with your, and you think about scaling, the focus moves from solely on acquisition and more looking at acquisition and engagement. And so you've basically proven that your game can monetize. You've proven that there's a market for it. You've proven that some of those 1 day and 7 day and cost of acquisition and engagement metrics are working for you. So you also know what types of marketing might work to get you quantity, but how about quality and how about ROI? So these are some of the questions you should be asking yourself. So who are my most engaged users at this stage? And how do I get more of them? Doing a whale analysis at this point is when it really starts to get important. What's the behavior of my paying versus non-paying users? And a lot of this may seem basic, and we can go a lot deeper in a follow-up session, but I want to make sure that the basics are well understood. What's the behavior of my new versus returning users? They might exhibit very different patterns. In particular, on mobile with app version and device, and starting to filter by that information because each different version might have different things early on in the game, like a different tutorial or different requirements on download or different things that happen between install and first game, which are really important to consider. How can I get more users deeper into the app where they'll start monetizing? And what game mechanics can I test to increase virality, engagement, and retention? So there's a few more metrics that you ought to be looking at in this phase. All the same ones as you were looking at in phase 1. It kind of is compounding. You want to look at your cost of acquisition. You want to look at your 1 and 7 day retention, but also your 30-day retention at this point, because you really want to make sure that you're able to engage long-term and get those quality users that are extremely efficient to acquire and monetize. You want to look at your average session length. So those are kind of a repeat of the 4 that I talked about in phase 1. But you also at this point want to look at your percent of paying users. Really important stat at this point. Are you able to convert free guys into paying guys? You're going to want to look at your 1, 7, and 30 day average revenue per user, and also average revenue per paying user. Right? So at each different cohort, 1, 7, and 30 day average revenue per user and average revenue per paying user. And lastly, just revenue. You know, it's the most basic stat. It's obviously the one that everybody looks at all the time, in particular the guy at the top. But it's absolutely critical that when you look at revenue, you look at what the drivers are so you can continue to iterate on that very regular release schedule. Do you have anything to add on this?
Well, it's one thing which is fun for us to measure in this stage as well, is that let's say to acquire a poker player on Facebook, it's about $1, probably a bit more, but to acquire a city builder user, it's about 55 cents. What we've been doing while doing marketing, we're measuring the effectiveness of both users acquired. So if a city builder user which comes into our game, because Governor of Poker is city building and poker combined, we can measure if the revenue of that city builder user is the same or hopefully even better than the poker user, so that way we know how to market and to acquire new users from what area. So it can save a lot of money on, you know, the marketing stuff, on the and also acquiring the users. So we can measure if we can go more into the you know, city building user group, or we can need to move into the poker group. That's interesting data, especially in this stage also. Yep. I don't think many games are having those, you know, options, but yep. In our case it's good data.
Okay, and now the final stage, the harvest stage. As you see, it's kind of compounding. You're still looking at acquisition metrics, you're still looking at engagement metrics, and mostly retention metrics, and most importantly, long-term monetization efforts. So basically, your game at this stage is monetizing efficiently, and you want to figure out a system for kind of keeping it there. A lot of guys on Facebook have kind of figured out how to do this, and it's pretty well proven that every Facebook game has a shelf life. Even Zynga games have a shelf life with their DAU and MAU counts. No one is immune to it. And on mobile, it's actually kind of unproven what the shelf life is because there are so few that have made it to this harvest point, but we do know it's a lot more fickle because of the App Store rankings and the way organic traffic does or does not get pushed to your app as a result. But some of the big questions that we try to help our clients ask is, what's the behavior of my paying versus non-paying users? Another big one. We talked about that in the last one, but it's still big here. What's the LTV of my users by different cohorts? So it's at this point you start looking at predictive LTV based on both behavioral characteristics, demographic characteristics, and how people are overall interacting with your game and the decisions they make in the game. It's not the easiest math problem to solve, but it's one that we've solved for a lot of our clients. And LTV, to keep that kind of shelf life as long as possible, is absolutely critical to understand at this stage. It'll help you think much more long-term with your game. How can I keep my paying users engaged and happy? Seems like a fairly basic one, but often forgotten. How can I optimize my basket of virtual goods? How can I optimize the prices of my virtual goods? And what's the behavior of my users over their entire lifetime? And what are the metrics? So the key performance indicators. It's all the ones I mentioned before: acquisition costs, retention, engagement, percent paying users, 1, 7, and 30-day ARPU and ARPPU, and last but not least, revenue and LTV. So measuring LTV at this stage is absolutely critical. Do you have anything to add on the harvest stage? Have you?
No, we are still in the assumption our lifetime is 6 years for the game. So. Although poker is very stable. If you look at Single Poker, it's one of the most stable games on Facebook.
Yeah, that's right.
For a long time already. So.
Yep. Okay, the last slide, I just want to see if I can click, and this clicker doesn't seem to want to work. Okay. So for all you snowboarders, we've been talking about skiing all this time. Snowboarding is kind of like mobile, right? So the guys that are now building on mobile, how many people in this room are building specifically for iOS or Android right now? And how many of you that have your hands raised were originally building on Facebook and are making the transition? A little bit? Okay. So we're seeing a lot of transition from Facebook to iOS in particular, and also Android, but not as much. We're also noticing that a lot of the fundamentals are almost identical in social and mobile. Not just in terms of user play and engagement, but in terms of the fundamental way that you should use data to understand your user base. You truly can use the fundamental learnings that you got in Facebook and apply it to iOS. But note some of the differences, right? So it's still all about your cost of acquisition and your lifetime value. But some things that are inherently different, obviously tracking requests sent and stream posts are not relevant on iOS or Android. That K-factor metric that measures virality, or the viral coefficient, that has really become kind of a standard metric on Facebook, at least for our clients, is not really in play quite as much in mobile, while a lot of social platforms are emerging, and there's a lot of good ones doing it right now. Those kind of metrics that are very Facebook specific that help to lower your acquisition cost are not at play. Cohort analysis of users based on demographics is obviously very difficult because the App Store strips all of the information, and not only the demographics, but also what's the source. Where did I get my users? Not as important for Apple to tell you that, because all you got to know is they came from the App Store. That's a problem that I think is being felt universally across any mobile development. And for those of you that are just building on Facebook or any other social network around the world, before you get into mobile, consider the fact that it is very challenging to understand how well you're monetizing your marketing efforts and looking at it on a channel-by-channel basis. It's a problem that we're helping our clients solve, but it's actually a lot of work. Yeah. Another problem is jailbroken phones. Present a big problem. It can be extremely misleading if you look at your numbers and you include hacked phones in the stats. I've worked with some clients who have up to 30% of their users are coming in through jailbroken phones right now, and you cannot track the data in the same way, so you have to make sure you create a cohort just for that and separate it out and consider the benefits that getting jailbroken phone users can present, but also how critical it is to understand who's there, because you won't have any monetization information about those jailbroken phone users. And lastly, at least on my, and I know you've got some as well, it's really difficult to run arbitrary A/B testing on iOS because of the app resubmission process. So it's tough to get the data out of the App Store, but because of the way that we like to iterate on Facebook, which is kind of a fast cycle where you put up the best product that you can and then you kind of keep iterating, iOS makes it very difficult, and if you don't get it right the first time, it's very difficult to improve. And I know you had a comment about that.
Well, yeah, we also develop mobile titles, and we also develop PC titles, and from that we learned the big difference is that with social and Facebook, you need to start quickly, and then with the knowledge you get and the data, iterate, change, and improve. With mobile, you have kind of only one shot. The game going out on the iOS, on the App Store, it needs to be really good. Other than that, it won't be any successful. So it has to be more of a complete game already, and you really have to realize that difference, because it's a huge difference. You can go much easier on the Facebook. It has to be good, but it can change, and with mobile that's more difficult. But you are allowed to improve the game, so you can still make it better and monetize it better, but not too much. Yeah.
So at Contagion, we spent a year. We've had our Facebook and social game dashboard available for the last 3 years. We spent an entire year building out the mobile dash, and actually, if you look at the two, so you look at the charts that are being visualized in the Facebook dashboard versus the iOS dashboard, they're almost identical. The year was spent dealing with the technical challenges involved with getting the offline data and understanding the attribution and all the stuff that you guys don't have to deal with now that a lot of these problems have been solved. But for the purposes of this discussion, the fundamentals around mobile acquisition and mobile retention and mobile monetization are very similar, if not identical, to social, with the exception of virality. Okay? So that's it for the presentation. Happy to open up the floor to questions for either me or Jur.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, excellent presentation. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. If anyone has a question, I can keep the ball rolling. You start off your presentation with these 7 key factors. Obviously, you have a lot of very prestigious clients. Without giving any proprietary information away, can you quickly go through some of those 7 parameters and tell us what range of values that it's good to have? What K factor is going to be good for a successful game? What ARPU and ARPU?
Yeah, I purposefully left those off.
I purposely left.
And I'm sure you noticed. Actually, in the last couple years, and I know here at Casual Connect even, we've actually presented benchmarks on each of those 7 metrics, which are great. And actually, we have benchmarks in our dashboard that present some of this information. We are deprecating that feature in our product and from our speeches, mostly because it can be incredibly misleading. The benchmarks or even the ranges vary greatly from game category to game category. So a poker game has very different acquisition and engagement and monetization opportunities and data points than a first-person shooter game, for instance. It's extremely different, or a farming game. So I can speak on a more individual basis, not up here, because I don't have the data in my head, because there's that'd be a big table. But on a category by category basis, if people are interested in benchmarks, we can have a follow-up conversation. And what I will say is there are a lot of policies that Facebook has kind of been launching over the last year, in particular around stream posts and the way that they allow virality to kind of flow and the viral loop to kind of happen within Facebook, which has caused K-factor actually to suffer. It's one of those stats that a couple years ago I think is what built Contagion. We were able to report on K-factor, and it was a math problem that we solved very, very early on that we understood. And today, we don't actually talk about K-factor quite as much. It's important. It's a very important lever that you can pull to lower your cost of acquisition. The more people that people are telling about your game and driving into your game organically, the better. Has no application on mobile, almost none at all. And on Facebook, it's become very difficult, and the policies change often enough that the ranges have actually gone down quite a bit.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions? We have a microphone here. Please wait for the mic, then we don't have to repeat the question. Thank you.
Yes, I have a slightly technical question because I always see people talking about lifetime values and all these things. What is the lifetime of a user? When do you consider a user lost?
When do you consider a user lost?
Yeah, so he might just be on a 2-month vacation. So what kind of models do you use to estimate the lifetime of a user and then to get an average distribution or something of these things?
That's a great question. So the way that we've calculated, Rio, do you know exactly how we've calculated lifetime value?
Lifetime value, that's that we calculate on. That's just based on revenue.
Yeah, that's just adding up. But actually, the lifetime.
Yeah.
When is a user gone?
How do you predict that?
I mean, that's a very philosophical question.
Sorry, this is Rio, one of our data scientists, who I recruited from London to answer these kinds of questions.
So I'd say that's a very philosophical. I mean, I think it's a question that probably comes up a lot. You have a DAU, MAU, right? So you could look at it from that perspective. But if I were you, your users never lost. I mean, you still have a way to get out to these people, I hope. And your focus should be really on the reacquisition effort. You know, you might run a reacquisition campaign. I would just focus on that and then try to avoid that philosophical question that could funnel you into.
But if you go one step further, we would first need to know when to start the reacquisition part. So we would need to know when the user's lost. And if we know that, we can do a pre-reacquisition targeting campaign. So we can sort of, okay, so we're seeing that he's stopping to play, you know, there are some kind of metrics.
You mean
that
an engagement,
using, yeah.
an engagement campaign?
Yeah, engagement campaign.
Yeah.
So not a lot of people go on a holiday for 2 months.
Not yet. So. I think you can actually assume that most people don't go on holiday for 2 months, and if they're gone for 2 months, I'm sure we actually have some bands that say, you know, if 1 month gone, they don't return. If 2 months gone, this many don't return. If 3 months gone, and the curve just kind of goes up. That's actually all factored into our predictive LTV calculation. And the reason I can't answer that is because we have an applied mathematics PhD that's been a year solving this problem. And if he was up here, he could bore us to death for an hour, literally talking about all of the different elements that went into that mathematical equation, which includes likelihood of someone returning if gone for those periods of time, and baking into it's a very large algorithm, you know, how does that factor into what that lifetime value is of that user if these 25 things happen or do not happen. So it's a hard question to answer. It's the right question to ask, but what we can say is if you keep your players engaged and you look at some of the early trends that tell you whether or not 1 day is different from 7 days, different from 30-day retention, and you look at your average session length, and you look at other things that tell you whether or not engagement is healthy, you can hopefully avoid that. But answering that question it's not black and white. I'm sorry.
Any more questions? Well, first of all, thank you again for doing I know how hard it is to do these presentations and stand-up, so thank you very much for coming in.
Yeah, thanks.